It was supposed to be just another day on The View. The lights were bright, the audience was buzzing with excitement, and the cameras were ready to roll. But behind the scenes, there was a quiet tension in the air. Something big was about to happen, and even the crew could feel it. Mel Gibson had arrived. He wasn't just there for small talk. He had a new movie coming out, and he wanted to talk about it. But everyone knew that Gibson wasn't like most guests. He had a reputation for speaking his mind, whether people liked it or not. Over the years, he'd made headlines, not always for the right reasons. Some admired him for his honesty. Others saw him as someone who didn't care about what society expected. Across the table sat Whoopi Goldberg, a legend in her own right. She'd been on The View for years, known for her sharp tongue, quick wit, and willingness to challenge anyone, even stars twice her size. She didn't back down from a fight, and she never held back when she believed something was wrong. Now they were face to face. The producers hadn't planned for fireworks, but deep down, maybe they hoped for a little drama. That's how TV worked these days. People clicked, watched, and shared when things got heated. And this had all the signs of something unforgettable. As the show began, the audience clapped politely. Gibson smiled, waved, and took his seat. Whoopi greeted him with a nod. Cool, calm, professional. On the surface, everything looked normal, like just another celebrity interview. But if you listened closely, there was a spark in the air, like two strong forces about to collide. Backstage, the director gave the signal. Cameras zoomed in, the red light blinked, and the host welcomed Mel Gibson to the table. "Welcome back to The View, Mel," Whoopi said, leaning forward. Her voice was smooth, but there was something underneath it. Curiosity, maybe even caution. Gibson gave a slight grin. Good to be here. The first few minutes were easy. Gibson talked about his new film, the long hours on set, and how it felt to still be making movies after so many decades. He cracked a joke or two and the audience laughed. Whoopi smiled, nodded, asked follow-up questions. Everything was going smoothly, but then came the moment no one saw coming. Someone brought up the topic of Hollywood today. Not the movies, not the money, but the culture. What can be said, what can't, and who gets to decide. That's when the room changed. Whoopi leaned in again. Her tone shifted slightly, just enough to notice. You've always had strong opinions, Mel. Some people say you don't hold back. Gibson chuckled. I guess I never learned how to bite my tongue. The audience gave a polite laugh, but it was different this time. Nervous energy filled the space. This wasn't just a chat anymore. It was a clash waiting to happen. Behind the camera, someone whispered, "Keep rolling," and the rest of the world was about to watch. Because in just a few short minutes, Mel Gibson would do something no guest had done before. He would go head-to-head with Whoopi Goldberg, live on national television. And the audience? They wouldn't know what hit them. They clapped. They gasped. Some even stood up. One thing was clear. This was not going to be just another episode of The View. This was history being made, and it was only just getting started. The conversation started off light. Gibson was relaxed, leaning back in his chair with a calm smile on his face. He talked about how much he loved acting, not just for the fame or money, but because it gave him a chance to tell stories that mattered. The audience clapped politely. Whoopi nodded along, watching him closely, like someone waiting for the next move in a game. Then came the first real question. Mel, she said, you've been around Hollywood for a long time. Do you think it's changed? Like, really changed? Thought for a second before answering. Yeah, he said. It's different now. People are scared to say what they really feel. You say one thing wrong and boom, you're done. She didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, like she was trying to figure out if he was being serious or just playing the role of the rebel again. You know, she finally said. Some people would say that's a good thing, that maybe some voices shouldn't be heard. That line landed like a stone in water. A ripple passed through the studio. The audience shifted in their seats. Cameras zoomed in closer. Gibson didn't flinch. "I get that," he said, "but where does it stop? If we start picking and choosing who gets to speak, aren't we just doing the same thing dictators do?" There it was, that word, dictators. It sent a shockwave through the room. Some people in the crowd sat up straighter. Others exchanged looks. This wasn't just talk anymore. This was a fight over something bigger than either of them. Whoopi leaned forward again. "You make it sound like freedom of speech is perfect," she said. "But Mel, words hurt, and sometimes they should come with consequences." He smiled slightly, not in a mean way, but like he'd been waiting for this. "Sure," he said, "people should be responsible for what they say, but let's not pretend everyone plays by the same rules. Some folks can say anything and get a standing ovation. Others lose everything." A beat of silence followed. Not awkward, but heavy. Like the whole room was thinking the same thing. This is going somewhere big. The host tried to lighten the mood. "Okay, so, back to your movie?" she joked. But nobody was laughing. Whoopi took a breath. Then she hit him with it. "You know, Mel, you talk a lot about free speech, but I remember a time when you said things that hurt people, and you didn't get canceled. You got a pass." There it was. The past. The thing that followed Gibson like a shadow. Not just rumors or gossip, but real moments that had cost him. Jobs, friends, respect. For the first time, he looked a little tired. Not angry, just worn down by the memory. "I've made mistakes," he said slowly. "I'm not proud of all of it. But I've also lived long enough to grow. Isn't that part of being human?" The room stayed quiet. Even the crew behind the camera stopped moving for a second. Whoopi didn't look away. "Growing is one thing," she said. "But some lines don't move, Mel. Some things don't get erased just because time passes." The tension in the room was thick now. Not hate, not anger. Something more complicated. Disagreement. History. Two people who had seen the highs and lows of fame sitting across from each other, not as enemies, but not exactly friends either. Then Gibson surprised everyone. "You're right," he said. "Some things don't go away, but I still believe in saying what I think even if it costs me again." The audience didn't clap. Not yet. They were too busy absorbing what just happened. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about politics or movies. It was about truth. And it wasn't over. Behind the scenes, producers were watching closely. They knew what most people didn't yet, that this moment was only the beginning. Because in just a few minutes, the conversation would take a turn no one expected, and the world would never forget what happened next. The room was electric now. Every word felt heavier than the last. Whoopi leaned forward again, her expression sharp but calm, like someone who wasn't about to back down. Gibson sat still, his hands resting on the table, looking at her with a mix of respect and defiance. You could tell he was ready for whatever came next. "So let me ask you this," Whoopi said, her voice steady but cutting. "If free speech is so important, why do some people get away with saying things that hurt others? Why does it seem like only certain voices matter?" Gibson didn't answer right away. He took a moment, like he was weighing his words carefully. Then he spoke slowly, deliberately. "Because life isn't fair. Never has been, never will be. But here's the thing. Silencing someone doesn't fix anything. It just creates more anger, more division." Whoopi raised an eyebrow. "But Mel, don't you think there's a difference between speaking your mind and spreading hate? Like, where do we draw the line?" That question hung in the air like smoke after fireworks. The audience shifted nervously in their seats. Some nodded along with Whoopi, agreeing silently. Others crossed their arms, waiting to hear what Gibson would say next. "I'm not saying hate is okay," Gibson replied, his tone firm now. "But who gets to decide what's hate and what's just disagreement? One person's truth is another person's offense. Where does it stop?" Whoopi didn't hesitate. She leaned even closer, her voice rising slightly. "It stops when people start getting hurt. When kids are bullied online because someone thinks they're funny. When families are torn apart because someone decided their opinion mattered more than someone else's life. Her words hit hard. For a second, Gibson looked unsure, maybe even a little guilty. But then he straightened up, meeting her gaze head-on. "I agree," he said. "Hurting people is wrong. But canceling someone forever over one mistake? That doesn't help anyone either. People change. They grow. Don't we all deserve a chance to make things right?" Now the crowd was starting to react. Murmurs spread through the studio. Someone clapped softly, unsure if it was okay yet. Another person booed quietly, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The energy in the room was shifting fast from curiosity to tension to something almost raw. Whoopi paused, letting the silence stretch out. Then she said, "You talk about second chances, Mel. But what about responsibility? What about owning up to the damage you've done before asking for forgiveness?" This time, Gibson didn't smile or joke around. He looked at her, really looked, at her, like he was seeing her point for the first time. "I've owned my mistakes," he said finally, "and I've paid for them. But here's the thing. If we keep punishing people forever, how does anyone move forward? How does society heal?" Whoopi tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe moving forward means holding people accountable without giving them a free pass to repeat the same mistakes." The audience erupted, not full-on cheering or shouting yet, but a wave of reactions rippled through the room. Some people clapped loudly, clearly siding with Whoopi. Others stood up, nodding in agreement with Gibson. The rest just sat there, wide-eyed, watching two legends go toe-to-toe live on national TV. One of the co-hosts tried to jump in. "Guys, let's take a step back," she said, laughing nervously. "We're supposed to be talking about movies. Remember?" But no one cared about movies anymore. Gibson chuckled, breaking the tension just a little. "Yeah, I guess we got sidetracked." Whoopi smirked. "Sidetracked? Mel, you walked right into this." The crowd laughed, but it was clear. They weren't done yet. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was personal. Raw. Real. Then Gibson did something unexpected. He turned to the audience, his voice softer now. "Look, I'm not perfect. Nobody is. All I'm saying is let's stop pretending we can shut people up and call it progress. Progress happens when we listen, not just to the voices we agree with, but to the ones that challenge us." For a moment, the entire studio went silent. Even Whoopi seemed taken aback. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Was she thinking about responding? Or was she realizing that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as far apart as they seemed? Before she could say anything, the host jumped in again. "Wow. Okay, let's take a quick break, everyone," she announced, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The audience was buzzing, and the cameras kept rolling. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged frantic glances. No one had expected this kind of intensity. Social media was already blowing up. Clips of the exchange were being shared faster than anyone could keep track. By the time the show returned from commercial, the world would know exactly what had happened. And when the conversation resumed, it would get even bigger. Because this wasn't just about free speech or accountability. It was about humanity. And neither Whoopi nor Gibson was backing down anytime soon. When the show came back from commercial, the energy in the room was electric. The audience wasn't just watching anymore, they were part of it. Some people leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Others whispered to their neighbors, pointing at the screen or gesturing toward Mel Gibson and Whoopi Goldberg. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but there was also excitement. This wasn't scripted TV drama. This was real life unfolding live. Whoopi didn't waste any time. As soon as the host gave her the floor, she turned to Gibson with fire in her eyes. "Okay, Mel," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "Let me ask you this. Do you think accountability is optional? Like if someone hurts people, should they just get a pass because they said sorry?" Gibson raised an eyebrow. Clearly not. Backing down. "No one's getting a free pass," he replied. "But I do think forgiveness matters. If we don't forgive, how does anyone move forward?" Whoopi shook her head. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. You can forgive someone, sure, But that doesn't mean you let them off the hook for what they did. The audience started reacting louder now. A few clapped after Whoopi spoke, agreeing with her point. Others shouted out support for Gibson, cheering him on. The co-hosts looked uneasy, glancing at each other like they weren't sure whether to step in or let the moment play out. Gibson leaned forward, his tone firmer now. Look, I'm not saying consequences don't matter. Of course they do. But here's the problem. If we only focus on punishing people, we miss the chance to actually change things. Real progress happens when we teach, not tear down. Whoopi crossed her arms, unimpressed. Teaching doesn't work unless someone's willing to learn, Mel. And some people aren't. They doubled down instead of owning up. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. People stood up, shouting encouragement to both sides. Someone yelled, "You tell him, Whoopi." Another voice called out, "Mel's right." The studio felt like it might burst into chaos, but somehow the conversation kept going. Gibson took a deep breath, looking directly at Whoopi. "I hear you," he said, "and I respect your perspective. But let me ask you something. Who gets to decide who deserves a second chance? Because if it's up to the court of public opinion, then nobody's safe." Whoopi didn't blink. "Maybe that's the point," she shot back. "If you know the world is watching, maybe you'll think twice before opening your mouth." Now the audience was fully engaged. Claps turned into cheers. Cheers turned into standing ovations. Some people were on their feet, yelling support, for one side or the other. The cameras panned across the room, capturing every reaction. Social media was exploding outside the studio, but inside, it felt like time had stopped. Everyone was focused on these two heavyweights going head-to-head. One of the co-hosts tried to intervene again. "Guys, let's take a step back," she said nervously. "We're supposed to be talking about movies, remember? But no one cared about movies anymore. Not even the producers could steer the ship back on course. This was bigger than entertainment, bigger than ratings. It was about values, beliefs, and the kind of society people wanted to live in." Gibson turned to the audience, his voice softer, but still powerful. "Here's the thing. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for fairness, for everyone to have a shot at redemption. Isn't that what humanity is all about?" The crowd went wild. Some people cheered loudly, moved by his words. Others booed, shaking their heads in disagreement. Whoopi watched the reaction, her expression unreadable. She took a moment before responding, choosing her words carefully. "Redemption is important," she admitted, "but so is justice. You can't talk about one without the other. And sometimes justice means holding people accountable, not letting them slide because they said the magic words." For a brief second, the room fell silent. Even the most vocal members of the audience sat back down, absorbing the weight of what she'd just said. Then slowly the noise returned. Clapping, cheering, debating. The studio felt alive in a way it never had before. Gibson smiled faintly, nodding at Whoopi. "Fair enough," he said. "We might not agree on everything, but I respect where you're coming from." Whoopi returned the nod, her tone softening just a little. "Same here. We won't solve this today, but at least we're having the conversation." The audience erupted again, this time with a mix of applause and laughter. For all the tension, there was a sense of respect between the two. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about honesty, about putting it all out there, no matter how uncomfortable it got. As the segment neared its end, the host jumped in one last time. "Wow, okay, I think we need to wrap this up before the whole building collapses," she joked, trying to lighten the mood. The audience laughed, but it was clear they didn't want it to end. Before the cameras cut away, Gibson turned to Whoopi one final time. "Thanks for the debate," he said sincerely. "It's rare to find someone who can go toe-to-toe like that." Whoopi smirked, her usual wit shining through. "Anytime, Mel. Just don't make me regret it." The crowd roared, giving both of them a standing ovation. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for posterity. By the time the show went to break, millions of viewers were already talking about what they'd just witnessed. And as the credits rolled, one thing was certain. This wasn't just another episode of The View. This was history. By the time the credits rolled, the studio was buzzing like a beehive. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and even arguing among themselves. Some stood frozen, replaying the debate in their minds, while others couldn't stop talking about it. The energy spilled out of the room and onto social media faster than anyone could have imagined. Within minutes, clips of the heated exchange started flooding Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Everyone had an opinion, and they weren't shy about sharing it. Backstage, the crew was scrambling. Producers huddled together, whispering furiously about how to handle the fallout. One of them muttered, "This is either going to make us legends or get us fired." Another laughed nervously, saying, "Probably both." Meanwhile, Mel Gibson and Whoopi Goldberg found themselves surrounded by staff offering water bottles, towels, and quiet congratulations. Neither of them looked exhausted, though. If anything, they seemed energized, like two boxers who'd gone 10 rounds and come out stronger for it. As they walked off set, someone from the team joked, "So, are you guys cool now?" Whoopi shot back with a grin. "Cool? No. Respectful? Maybe." Gibson chuckled, shaking his head. "You held your ground, I'll give you that." And just like that, the tension dissolved, at least between them. But outside the studio, the world was ablaze. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Mel vs. Whoopi and our free speech debate trended worldwide within hours. Fans of Gibson praised him for standing up for free speech, calling him brave and unapologetic. Supporters of Whoopi applauded her for holding her ground and demanding accountability. Memes popped up everywhere. Some funny, some serious, all adding fuel to the fire. Late-night talk shows jumped on the bandwagon almost immediately. Comedians mocked the exchange, turning it into skits and jokes. One host quipped, "I didn't know The View came with popcorn, but apparently it does." Another said, "If debates were this entertaining in school, we'd all have straight A's." News outlets weren't far behind. Cable networks dedicated entire segments to analyzing the showdown. Pundits debated whether Gibson's stance on free speech was justified or reckless. Others questioned if Whoopi's focus on accountability went too far, or not far enough. Opinion pieces poured in from every corner of the internet, dissecting every word, every gesture, every moment of tension. But it wasn't just the media that kept the conversation alive. It was the people. Friends argued over dinner tables. Families debated during holiday gatherings. Strangers clashed in comment sections, turning threads into battlegrounds. Even co-workers found themselves discussing it around the water cooler. For days, the clip dominated headlines. Clips of the debate racked up millions of views online. People rewound key moments, pausing to analyze facial expressions and body language. Every little detail became a topic of discussion. Whoopi's crossed arms, Gibson's slight smirk, the way the audience reacted at pivotal moments. And then something unexpected happened. People began reflecting, not just on what was said, but on why it mattered. Teachers used the clip in classrooms to spark discussions about freedom of speech versus responsibility. Community leaders referenced it in workshops about conflict resolution. Even psychologists weighed in, praising both Gibson and Whoopi for modeling respectful disagreement, a rare sight in today's polarized world. On The View's next episode, Whoopi addressed the aftermath directly. Sitting alone at the table, she smiled wryly as the audience erupted in applause. When the noise finally settled, she leaned forward and said, "Look, I don't expect everyone to agree with me. That's not the point. The point is we need to talk about these things. We can't just shut people down because we don't like what they're saying." Her co-hosts nodded along, chiming in with their thoughts. One of them joked, "Just maybe not quite so passionately next time." The audience laughed, but there was a sense of relief in the room. For all the chaos the debate had caused, it also felt cathartic, like a pressure valve had been released. Gibson, too, addressed the response in interviews later that week. Talking to a radio host, he admitted, "It got intense, but that's okay. Sometimes intensity is what it takes to move the needle. I'm glad we had the conversation, even if it made some people uncomfortable." When asked if he regretted anything, he shrugged. "Not really. I mean, yeah, it got heated. But isn't that better than pretending everything's fine when it's not?" His comments resonated with many. While critics continued to call him out for past controversies, others praised him for refusing to shy away from tough topics. Some even called the debate a turning point, a reminder that meaningful conversations require courage, honesty, and a willingness to listen. As the dust began to settle, one thing became clear. The debate had struck a nerve because it touched on something universal: freedom, accountability, redemption. These weren't abstract concepts. They were deeply personal issues that affected everyone in different ways. And though opinions remained divided, most agreed on one thing: the conversation was worth having. Even those who hated the debate couldn't deny its impact. It sparked dialogue, it challenged assumptions, and it reminded people that, despite our differences, we're all trying to figure out how to live together in a complicated world. Days turned into weeks, and the buzz eventually faded. Life moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. Celebrities returned to promoting their projects without causing international uproar. But for those who had watched the showdown live, or relived it through clips, the memory lingered. Because in a world where shouting often drowned out listening, Mel Gibson and Whoopi Goldberg had done something remarkable. They'd talked, really talked, and the world listened. Weeks passed, but the ripple effects of that day on The View refused to fade. The debate between Mel Gibson and Whoopi Goldberg had become more than just a viral moment. It was a cultural touchstone. People kept coming back to it, not because they agreed with either side, but because it made them think, really think, about what they believed, why they believed it, and how they wanted to live in a world where everyone didn't see eye to eye. For Whoopi, life went on as usual. She returned to her role as co-host, cracking jokes, sharing stories, and challenging guests when she felt it was necessary. But something shifted after that episode. Her interviews took on a new edge. Sharper, bolder, more unapologetic. She seemed emboldened, like the debate had reminded her why she loved hosting The View in the first place: to spark conversations that mattered. During one particularly candid segment, she opened up about the aftermath. "People keep asking me if I regret going toe-to-toe with Mel," she said, leaning back in her chair. "And my answer is no, not even for a second. You don't grow unless you challenge yourself, and others." Her co-hosts nodded, chiming in with their own reflections. One of them joked, "Just promise us you won't bring boxing gloves next time." The audience laughed, but there was an underlying respect in the room. Everyone knew that moment had changed the show forever. As for Gibson, he continued promoting his movie, but the conversation followed him everywhere. Late-night shows invited him to talk about the debate. Journalists asked for his thoughts during interviews. Even fans approached him at events, telling him how much the exchange had resonated with them. Some thanked him for standing by his beliefs, while others admitted they still disagreed, but appreciated the dialogue. In a sit-down interview with a morning news program, Gibson opened up about the experience. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Whoopi's tough, smart. She doesn't let anyone slide. But honestly, that's what made it so powerful. We didn't agree on everything, but we respected each other enough to have the conversation." When pressed about whether he'd do it again, he smiled faintly. "Absolutely. Look, I'm not perfect, no one is. But I believe in speaking your truth, even if it makes people uncomfortable. And yeah, maybe I stepped on some toes along the way. But silence scares me more." His words struck a chord. Critics who had dismissed him in the past began re-evaluating their opinions. Supporters doubled down, praising him for refusing to back down. Love him or hate him, no one could deny that Gibson had reignited a national conversation about free speech, accountability, and redemption. The debate also left its mark on The View itself. Ratings soared in the weeks following the episode, drawing in viewers who might never have tuned in otherwise. Producers noticed a shift in the types of questions being asked, not just surface-level chatter, but deeper, more meaningful discussions. Guests were encouraged to share their honest perspectives, even if it meant stirring up controversy. One producer later admitted, "We didn't plan for that moment to happen. But now we're chasing it. Because that's what people want, to hear real voices talking about real issues." Audiences responded in kind. Social media lit up with praise for the show's willingness to tackle tough topics. Fans flooded comment sections with messages like, "Finally, a talk show that feels authentic," and "This is why I watch The View. Keep it coming." But perhaps the most surprising outcome was the impact on viewers themselves. Across the country, people began having their own versions of the debate. Families gathered around kitchen tables to discuss accountability versus forgiveness. Friends exchanged text messages debating the limits of free speech. Strangers struck up conversations on buses and in coffee shops, finding common ground despite their differences. Teachers incorporated the clip into lesson plans, using it as a springboard for classroom discussions about civics, ethics, and communication. Community leaders referenced it in workshops about conflict resolution. Even psychologists highlighted the exchange as an example of respectful disagreement, a rarity in today's polarized climate. Months later, when the dust had fully settled, both Whoopi and Gibson reflected on the lasting legacy of that day. In separate interviews, they echoed similar sentiments. The debate hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about connection, about understanding, about reminding people that it's possible to disagree without dehumanizing each other. Whoopi summed it up best during a charity event. Standing on stage, microphone in hand, she looked out at the crowd and said, "You know, sometimes the hardest thing to do is listen, especially when someone's saying something you don't want to hear. But that's how we grow. That's how we learn. So here's my challenge to all of you. Find someone who thinks differently than you and really listen. Not to argue, not to convince, but to understand." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering not just for her words, but for the spirit behind them. Respect, empathy, dialogue. Gibson echoed the sentiment during a film festival Q&A. Asked about the future of public discourse, he shrugged and said, "I think we'll always have disagreements. That's part of being human. But I hope we can learn to disagree better, to fight fair, to remember that, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to figure this thing out together." His answer earned a standing ovation, proving once again that authenticity resonates. People didn't love him or Whoopi because they were perfect, they loved them because they were real. In the end, the debate became more than just a headline, more than just a viral clip. It became a reminder of what's possible when two strong voices come together, not to tear each other down, but to build something bigger, something meaningful, something human. And though the world moved on to the next scandal, the next controversy, the next big story, the memory of that day lingered, a testament to the power of conversation, of honesty, of courage. Because in a world that often feels divided, moments like these remind us of one simple truth: we may not always agree, but we can always listen.